The following story is inspired by a real courtroom moment presided over by Judge Frank Caprio, a moment that has become one of the most heartfelt and unforgettable in his entire career. This isn't just a tale about justice, it's a living lesson in kindness, fatherly devotion, and quiet compassion. That's why this moment touched millions around the world. Stay with me until the very end. I promise, not a single second of this story will feel wasted. The courtroom was quiet. Judge Frank Caprio stepped through the wooden doors with his usual calm, the kind of calm earned by decades of listening more than speaking. He paused briefly at the bench, then turned his eyes toward the defense table. An old man stood there, not quite seated, his thin frame struggling to find balance as he reached for the back of the chair. A court officer made a move, but the man waved him off gently. He wanted to do this alone. Step by careful step, he lowered himself down. The movement was slow, almost fragile, yet filled with a quiet defiance, as if to say, "I may be old, but I still have my dignity." The name on the docket, Hiddleston Victor, age 96. The clerk stood. Case number 241. Mr. Victor Hiddleston is charged with a school zone speeding violation. A hush spread through the small courtroom like a shared breath held too long. It wasn't every day they saw a man that age here. Some tilted their heads, others crossed their arms, unsure what to expect. But Judge Caprio simply leaned forward and smiled gently. "Mr. Hiddleston," he began, "can you hear me all right?" The old man raised his chin, his voice soft but clear. "I can, Your Honor." Judge Caprio nodded. "You're charged with driving over the limit in a school zone." There was a pause. Victor's hands rested lightly on the table in front of him, the skin paper thin, the knuckles knotted with time. And just then, something fell from the pocket of his coat. A small square of white fabric, worn at the edges, fluttering like a leaf to the ground. The judge noticed it. "A handkerchief?" he asked. Victor's eyes distant for a beat, then focused. "Yes, it's mine," he said. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from memory. "My wife embroidered it when we were young, before the children, before the gray." He paused. "She passed a few years back, but I still carry it. Every time I take the boy to his tests, I carry it. Makes me feel like I'm not going alone." Silence. No gavel could cut through that kind of silence. Victor's breathing was slow, not labored, just tired. His shoulders slumped forward slightly, but his eyes remained steady, as though he were holding himself together for someone else's sake. "I understand this is a speeding ticket," Judge Caprio said, "but I'd like to understand what happened in your words." Victor nodded. "I don't drive fast, sir. I'm 96 years old. I drive slowly, carefully. I only drive when I have to." "And what brought you out that day?" Victor's hands tightened slightly around the edge of the table. "My boy, he needed a blood test." He exhaled, then added with quiet strength, "He has cancer. I take him to the clinic every 2 weeks. That morning, we were late." A murmur moved through the gallery. Even the court officer near the door seemed to shift his weight differently now. Arms crossed, not in scrutiny, but in respect. Judge Caprio looked at him for a long time. "96 years old," he said softly, "and still driving your son to his appointments." Victor gave the faintest of nods. Outside the window, the world moved on. Traffic lights blinked, people hurried. But in that small courtroom, time had slowed. Here sat a man, stooped but proud, carrying not just the weight of age, but of love that refused to fade. Judge Caprio leaned forward gently, his voice warm yet firm. "Mr. Hiddleston," he said, "you've been charged with speeding in a school zone. Do you understand the charge?" The man in the chair barely nodded. 96 years of life rested in that one motion. His shoulders were narrow, his back hunched with the quiet weight of time. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the sides of the defendant's bench. His voice, though weathered and fragile, carried the clarity of someone who knew exactly what he needed to say. "I don't drive fast, Judge," he began slowly. "I only drive when I have to." He paused, as if searching through memories not yet ready to be spoken aloud. "That morning," he continued, eyes lowered, "I was taking my son to get a blood test." There was a hush in the room, like the air itself leaned in to listen. "He's 63, the old man added. "My boy, and he has cancer." Every 2 weeks I take him. I don't drive unless I have to. Judge Caprio nodded but didn't speak. He didn't need to. Mr. Hiddleston's words hung there, soft but immovable. There was no protest in his tone, no drama, just the plain, steady truth of a father who had not stepped away from his post. At an age when most men are helped into chairs and led gently through quiet afternoons, Mr. Hiddleston was still behind the wheel, not for himself, but for the son he once carried in his arms, who now leaned on him for strength. "If not me, then who?" he asked, his voice breaking just slightly. "Who's going to get him there?" No one in the courtroom answered. They couldn't. A few shifted in their seats. One woman near the back reached for a tissue. The judge's fingers rested on his desk, unmoving. He looked at the old man with eyes not of a judge but of a father. "I understand," he said quietly. Mr. Hiddleston gave the single nod. His eyes, glassy but dry, didn't blink. There was something sacred in that exchange. The unspoken recognition between two men who both knew what it meant to carry another's burden, not as obligation, but as instinct. A bond older than law, deeper than duty. The old man sat back, as if the telling had cost him something. And perhaps it had. In rooms like this, words often feel like currency. But what he'd just given wasn't defense. It was devotion. It wasn't about the fine, or the ticket, or the speed. It was about a father showing up, again and again, even when time tells him he doesn't have to. Outside, traffic passed by the courthouse without pause. Inside, time had slowed, not in suspense, but in reverence. At 96, Mr. Hiddleston had nothing left to prove. And yet, in that moment, he'd reminded every person in that room, and many who would watch later, what it looks like when love keeps going, mile after mile, no matter the cost. He didn't need a lawyer. He didn't need to plead. All he needed was the truth. And the truth, when spoken without bitterness or pride, has a way of changing the temperature of a room. The judge looked down at his notes, then back at the man. "We'll continue," he said softly, but his tone had changed. "I don't drive unless I have to," he repeated gently, as if the truth needed to be laid down softly, like a blanket over a restless child. Frank Caprio didn't interrupt. He simply leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench, eyes steady but softened. He had heard thousands of cases, but this was not a case, it was a confession, wrapped in duty and love. Victor reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket. It was a movement that took time. His fingers fumbled for a second before pulling out a small folded paper, worn and crinkled from being opened too many times. He held it out with both hands, careful not to tear it. "It's not much," he said, barely louder than a whisper. "Just something I wrote down." The judge nodded. An officer walked over, received the paper, and brought it to the bench. Caprio took it delicately, like he was holding something more than paper, something sacred. The courtroom stayed silent. The people in the pews behind Victor leaned in, but not for gossip. They leaned in because their hearts had moved toward him. Unfolding the page, Caprio saw handwritten lines, shaky and uneven. Each line carried a date and a time. April 12th, 9:15 a.m. April 26th, 9:15 a.m. May 10th, 9:15 a.m. and so on. Victor lowered his eyes. "That's the blood test schedule for my boy," he said. "Every 2 weeks. Never missed one. I write them down so I don't forget." His voice caught just for a moment. Caprio didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence was the kind that held something vast. Victor continued, "It's not far, but every mile feels longer now, you know?" The judge nodded again, but his throat tightened. He looked at the schedule once more. It wasn't a medical record. It wasn't official. It didn't carry stamps or signatures. But it was more powerful than any document that might have come from a hospital. It was proof of presence, of constancy, of a father's quiet war against time. "You wrote every single one by hand?" Caprio finally asked. Victor smiled faintly. "Yes, sir. I don't trust myself to remember these things the way I used to. Writing helps." A pause followed, long and heavy. "His name's John," Victor added. "He's the only one I got left, and cancer's a cruel thing. I can't cure it, but I can drive him. I can sit in the waiting room. I can hold his jacket when he's too tired to stand." A woman sitting behind Victor wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. Another man pressed his lips tight, eyes glistening, and yet Victor, for all his trembling, didn't look for sympathy. He wasn't asking for mercy. He was sharing a duty, a ritual, a love so constant it had turned into routine, and yet it remained sacred. Judge Caprio placed the paper down, carefully folding it again. He looked at Victor and saw not a man who had violated a traffic rule, but a man who had traveled every road for someone else. Caprio cleared his throat gently and leaned forward, his voice warm and low. "Mr. Hiddleston, would you like a moment to rest? We can take a short break if you need it." Victor shook his head softly. "No, thank you, Judge. I'm all right." The judge gave a quiet nod. "Very well. I just want to make sure you're comfortable." Then he paused, his eyes not leaving Victor's face. His tone shifted slightly, not in authority, but in compassion. "You know, this isn't just a speeding violation, not today. This is something else. This is a lesson in love." Victor didn't reply at first. He nodded gently, his eyes slightly misty. He gripped the armrest of his chair as if it were the handle of an old tractor or the steering wheel of a family car, something he'd held on to for a lifetime. Judge Caprio continued, "May I ask, did you serve in the military?" There was a pause, then a quiet, weathered voice. "Yes, sir. I was in the infantry. World War II." A hush fell across the courtroom. Even those sitting in the back, who might have wandered in for a parking ticket or a traffic fine, felt the shift. This wasn't about a ticket anymore. This was about a man who had given his youth to war and his old age to love. Caprio's voice softened. "So you've served your country in more ways than one." Victor gave a faint smile, the kind that comes from a place of quiet pride and long memories. "I suppose so." The judge nodded, more to himself than anyone else. "You're not only a remarkable father, Mr. Hiddleston. You're a hero." Victor shifted slightly in his seat. "I don't know about that." Caprio looked at him kindly. "Let me tell you what I see. I see a man who never stopped showing up. Not for glory, not for praise, but because you made a promise. To your son, to your family, and you've kept it." There was a sudden movement in the back row. A woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue, then quickly looked down. Another person cleared his throat. Even the courtroom clerk glanced away from her screen, visibly moved. "I've seen a lot of people in this courtroom," Caprio said, "but there are a few I remember. A few who remind us what dignity looks like." He paused. "You're one of them." Victor didn't respond. He just nodded, slowly. His eyes shimmered with the weight of years, of battles fought far from home and closer than anyone knew. "And you still drive your son to his medical appointments. You still wake up, get dressed, walk out that door, and choose love again and again. That, Mr. Hiddleston, is what this country is made of." For a moment, nobody moved. The room seemed wrapped in a stillness too sacred to break. Judge Caprio leaned back again, his robe folding softly behind him, and looked out at the courtroom as if seeing something far beyond the wooden walls. In the quiet that followed, it wasn't law that filled the room. It was grace. It was understanding. And above all, it was the recognition that justice, at its purest, begins where empathy lives. Victor Hiddleston sat with his thin fingers resting on the edge of the defendant's bench. Across the room, a woman wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. She hadn't said a word since the hearing began, but the way she looked at Victor, as if she was holding her breath for both of them, spoke enough. That was his daughter-in-law. Judge Caprio noticed. His gaze shifted from the old man to the woman sitting quietly in the gallery, her shoulders trembling with each breath she tried to steady. He turned back to Victor, voice soft but clear. "Where is your son today, Mr. Hiddleston?" Victor's eyes followed the judge's, landing gently on the woman. He hesitated. His voice, when it came, was no louder than a whisper. He couldn't come today, Your Honor. He's too weak." He paused, then nodded toward the woman. "That's his wife. She came instead, even though she's not well herself." The courtroom grew still again. Victor's voice trembled as he continued. "But he didn't want me to stand here alone. So she came. She said to me this morning, 'If you have to carry the weight, at least let me walk beside you.'" The daughter-in-law lowered her head, unable to hold back the sob that broke the silence. The sound was small, but it rippled through the room like thunder wrapped in cloth. Judge Frank Caprio leaned back slightly, his hands folded on the bench in front of him. For a moment, he just watched the man before him, not as a defendant, but as a father. A father who had driven through school zones too fast, not because of recklessness, but because cancer doesn't wait for red lights. The judge had heard thousands of cases, some loud, some angry, some desperate. But this one had settled into his bones. And then, with the gentlest lift of voice, Judge Caprio said, "You see that young man sitting in the back corner?" He paused and tilted his head, drawing everyone's eyes. "That's my son." People turned, quietly, curiously. In the last row, near the wall, a man in his 40s raised a hand and gave a sheepish wave. He was grinning, the kind of grin that only a son gives when he knows his father is about to tell a story with him in it. "He's watching me right now," the judge continued, and a smile crept into his voice. "And I know exactly what he's thinking. He's saying, 'Dad, when you're in your 90s, am I going to have to drive you around too?'" Laughter rippled through the room. It was quiet, respectful, but full and real. Even Victor's tired face twitched into a soft grin, his eyes squinting slightly as if trying to keep up. It was a small moment, but it broke the tension like warm sun slipping through a cold window. For a moment, the courtroom was not a courtroom. It was a family's living room. It was a waiting room in a hospital. It was a kitchen table where fathers and sons still talk. The judge leaned forward again. "He says I'm setting a bad example for his kid, that I'm putting a lot on the old man." A beat passed. And maybe he's right. The room chuckled again. The tension had thinned now, like steam rising off a cooling cup of tea. The faces that had been tight with emotion were starting to soften. Even the guards near the door had relaxed their stance. Victor blinked slowly, his head turning toward the back of the room where the judge's son sat. It wasn't clear if he had caught the whole exchange. Maybe age had made his hearing a little unreliable, or maybe the weariness of the morning had dulled his senses. But something in the air had shifted, and he felt it, the way a man senses weather before it comes. He gave a faint nod, more to himself than to anyone else. There are many kinds of strength in a courtroom. The strength to prosecute, the strength to defend, the strength to forgive. But this quiet moment of laughter was another kind. The strength to breathe, to let the heart stretch again after being clenched so tightly. Judge Caprio looked back at Victor and smiled, not as a judge now, but as a father. "Mr. Hiddleston," he said softly, "I think you've taught us all something today. I've listened carefully, not just to your words, but to your life." There was a pause, one that asked for no answer. "I hereby dismiss this case," he continued. "There will be no fine, no penalty. What you've done for your son, the love, the duty, the faithfulness, cannot be measured by statute. It is a higher kind of justice. And today, this courtroom honors that." A soft sigh rippled through the room. Mr. Hiddleston didn't respond at first. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, as if receiving something more than a verdict. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps a breath of rest he hadn't allowed himself to take in years. When he opened them again, his gaze was clearer. "I wish you strength, sir," the judge added, "for yourself and for your son. May the road ahead be lighter. May love continue to lead you, as it has all along." At the clerk's table, Ms. Daniels, who had worked dozens of hearings that day alone, blinked away the mist in her eyes. She lowered her head under the guise of checking paperwork, though there was nothing left to write. Across the aisle, the young court assistant, only in his second month, let his pen fall beside his notebook. His jaw was set, but his eyes were red. In the gallery, a man in a postal uniform sat motionless, hands folded. Beside him, a woman clutched her purse to her chest, whispering something that only she could hear. And near the back, a law student, there on assignment, finally closed his laptop, too moved to pretend he was taking notes. Mr. Hiddleston shifted his weight and began to rise. His knees trembled slightly, but he didn't reach for help. The folder stayed close to him. One hand moved instinctively to his jacket pocket, pressing gently where the handkerchief rested, soft with age, worn with memory. His daughter-in-law, seated silently in the corner since the start, moved to his side. She took his arm, but didn't speak. Her eyes said everything. "He's carried us more times than we've ever known," she thought. As they turned to leave, something unexpected happened. The bailiff, usually unmoved by such hearings, opened the courtroom door, not out of routine, but with quiet respect, and as Mr. Hiddleston reached the threshold, he paused. Slowly, he looked back at the chair he'd risen from. A small nod, perhaps to the judge, perhaps to the room itself, perhaps to life. Judge Caprio watched him go, his heart remembering a different man, his own father, who once carried burdens with the same quiet strength. For a second, he saw them overlap, and then it happened. A man in the third row stood, no words, just a soft clap. Another joined, then another. In seconds, the entire room was standing, not in celebration, but in reverence. The applause was gentle, like rain on dry soil. It didn't roar, it echoed, and in that echo lived something sacred. Outside, the wind stirred lightly. Autumn sun spilled across the courthouse steps as Mr. Hiddleston stepped out into the day. His footsteps were still slow but no longer heavy. The folder, the handkerchief, the story, all pressed close to his chest. The city moved on around him, unaware that within a quiet courtroom, justice had spoken with the voice of mercy. And as he walked away, he did not look back again, because love had carried him this far, and mercy would carry him the rest of the way. Thank you for joining me today. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, then you know this was more than just a court case. It was a quiet lesson in what love really looks like. Mr. Victor Hiddleston didn't stand before the judge to defend a mistake. He stood there to protect the dignity of his son. At 96 years old, he wasn't asking for sympathy. He was simply doing what he believed was right. Showing up, driving when needed, holding the weight of a sick loved one with all the strength his aging body could carry. And when his voice trembled, it wasn't out of fear. It was the sound of a father whose love has not aged, even if his hands had. When he pointed to the woman in the gallery, his daughter-in-law, and said she came in her husband's place, even though she too was struggling. That moment spoke louder than any argument or defense could. Judge Frank Caprio didn't just dismiss a case that day. He saw a man, a family, and a kind of quiet bravery that the world often overlooks. This story reminds us that sometimes the most heroic acts are the ones done without noise, without credit, just love. If this story moved you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe it reminded you of your own father, your mother, or someone who carried you when you couldn't walk alone. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you won't miss the next story. Because sometimes, the smallest moments leave the deepest mark. See you in the next one.